Are you also tired of one-size-fits-all weight loss plans? Meet Noom, the personalized solution that meets you where you are. Noom is able to understand your unique needs, from dietary restrictions to medical concerns. Unlike restrictive programs, Noom embraces your lifestyle and choices. Discover a sustainable approach to weight loss, tailored just for you. Honestly, Noom felt like it was made for me. It's not just about what I eat, it's about understanding why. With Noom, I've learned so much about myself and built healthier habits that stick. It's all about progress, not perfection. Say goodbye to restrictive diets and experience the Noom app for yourself with personalized lessons and expert coaching. Noom's psychology and biology-based approach has helped over 5.2 million people achieve their goals. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom's psychology and biology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com. That's Noom.com. And check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold.
Fill your summer with the sun-kissed sweetness of Amigos Refreshers. There's strawberry acai, blueberry dragon fruit, and mango passion fruit, each a tropical delight. So skip the hot coffee and amp up your day with the plant-based natural caffeine and fruity flavor fusions in an Amigos Refresher. These cool thirst quenchers are just $3.99, or there's a mega 32-ounce size for $4.99. Recharge with the bold, fresh flavor of an energizing refresher at Amigos.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I have quite an episode for you. This is actually part one of a 5-part series I am starting about Agatha Christie and the theater. We have talked about so very many aspects of Agatha Christie's oeuvre on this podcast, and we've talked a little bit about her plays and her theatrical endeavors, but not nearly enough, because Agatha Christie's work in the theater is an important part of the work that she did, and an aspect of her career that I think sometimes people neglect. And by people, I suppose I mean I, myself. So we are going to rectify that, starting with today's episode. I am not going to be airing this 5-part series in succession. The series will be unspooling over the next couple of months, but just know that there is more content to come having to do with Agatha Christie and the theater. And boy, are we starting things off right with the interview I am bringing you today with Julius Green, the authority on Agatha Christie and the theater. Let's just get right to the interview, where I explain who Julius is up top, and then we get into a conversation I enjoyed so very much. Here goes. Anyone who has been listening to this podcast for a while will have heard of my guest, Julius Green, many times by now. I've quoted and referenced him so frequently, pretty much every time I've covered anything having to do with Agatha Christie's theatrical endeavors. That is because in 2015, he published the definitive book on Agatha Christie and the theater, Curtain Up, Agatha Christie, A Life in the Theater. Julius is an Olivier Award-winning theater producer and a fellow of the Birkbeck Center for Contemporary Theater at the University of London. He produced the 2001 Agatha Christie Theater Festival, a 12-week season of Christie's complete stage works, as then known. And in 2006, he founded the Agatha Christie Theater Company for Bill Kenwright Limited. In 2012, he was invited to write the introduction to HarperCollins' 60th anniversary edition of The Mousetrap and Other Plays. And in 2015, HarperCollins published his book on Agatha Christie and the theater. His numerous appearances as a speaker on Agatha Christie include the Oxford Literary Festival, the National Theatre's Platform Series, the International Agatha Christie Festival, and the 2017 and 2019 Agatha Christie Conferences. In 2017, he became the archivist for the historic production records of The Mousetrap. In 2020, he directed and co-adapted Agatha Christie's unpublished play The Lie for Radio 4 and was awarded a PhD for his work on Christie's plays by Goldsmiths, University of London. His other books include How to Produce a West End Show and Stars and Spies, which examines the links between espionage and show business. and is co-authored with MI5's official historian, Professor Christopher Andrew. I have been meaning to have him come onto the podcast for some time now to talk about Agatha Christie and the theater. Welcome, Julius.
Hello, I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So, Julius, I am going to have to start by reading out the first 2 sentences of the first chapter of your book. This is the story of the most successful female playwright of all time. She also wrote some books. One of the things I love about your book is that even though it is nonfiction and it covers a lot of ground, it has a real narrative voice with a lot of personality and even some snark. And right out the gate, you hit us with this rather cheeky opening. I wonder if you could explain what your purpose was in framing the conversation this way. Are we that conditioned to think of Agatha Christie as a writer of novels rather than a playwright?
Well, yes. I mean, it's what you call a provocation, isn't it? Really, and that was my whole raison d'être with this book. It actually came about because I was asked to write the introduction to the 60th anniversary Mousetrap play collection, which HarperCollins were publishing. So they were publishing the Mousetrap and other plays, the old collection that HarperCollins used to publish, a rather odd selection of 7 or 8 plays, rather randomly chosen, including the Mousetrap. And for the 60th anniversary, I was asked to write an introduction to a new edition of that. And I started researching it and suddenly realized that there was a lot more to this story than meets the eye. I had, of course, produced the Agatha Christie Theatre Festival, where we produced at that time what we thought was the entire repertoire of Christie's plays. Little did we know that we'd find a dozen more. But while I was, I suppose my starting point, because it wasn't a hugely researched piece, but it was a proper article for the opening of the book, and I went to the library and I looked for books, about Agatha Christie's playwriting, and there was absolutely nothing. And I mean, my favourite was the Cambridge Companion to 20th Century Female Playwrights, which didn't even give her a footnote. And I thought, this is very odd. It's almost like she's been purposefully written out of theatrical history. So to me, I just wanted to take a stand on Agatha Christie's behalf. So it's quite a passion project for me to re-establish her status, because of course in the 1950s no one would have argued with this. She was the only female playwright to ever have had 3 plays on in West End theatres at the same time, which is a record held to this day. And The Mousetrap, of course, is the longest running theatrical production of any kind anywhere in the world ever. And those 2 things as a starting point are worthy of comment and admiration. And yet not even a footnote in the Cambridge Official History of Women Playwrights of the 20th century. So this is a battle. It's a fight back, and I'm flying the flag, and I want people to be aware that I feel strongly about this right from the beginning. And I think that does, as you say, possibly come across in some of my prose, which is not entirely complimentary of some of my predecessor commentators on this.
Well, it's very passionate, and that passion comes through. And as someone who also feels a lot of passion for Agatha Christie, I really appreciated it. And I think a lot of listeners, if they haven't picked up your book yet, will also appreciate that passion. So getting into the book a little bit, it's broken into 2 parts: before Agatha Christie met the producer Peter Saunders and after she met Peter Saunders. Yeah. And we'll certainly get to Peter Saunders in a moment, but you also just alluded to this. One of the more surprising things I learned from you in this book is just how many early plays Agatha Christie wrote, many of them unproduced during her lifetime. She, in fact, had a pretty rough go of it as a playwright in the first half of her career. And there was one play in particular that I found really fascinating, which I believe is a play you discovered while researching this book. I'm talking about The Lie. Could you tell us a little bit about The Lie and these early plays of Agatha Christie, which you also did not know about until you started researching this book?
Well, like you say, I mean, Agatha Christie Playwright is very much a story of 2 halves. She always wanted to be a playwright, and she says many times that she preferred writing plays to writing novels, which comes as a surprise to a lot of people. But she only really established herself as a playwright in the 1950s, when she, of course, was in her 60s. So people think of her as an older lady playwright, but in fact, as a young woman, she was writing a lot of plays. It just was that they weren't getting performed. Right. Her sister Madge had a play put on quite early, which was a big surprise to her, and led to some competition within the family, I think. The only play that Madge ever wrote, The Claimant, which went on in the 1920s. But I think the interesting thing about the plays that are in the archive that I sort of unearthed, that nobody had previously picked up, read, or commented on, is that they are comedies, they're domestic dramas. They are not detective stories. They're not murder stories. They're not crime stories. And they're perhaps more in the vein of what one might call Mary Westmacott, the non-crime novels that Agatha wrote later in life. So, yes, The Lie is a very powerful domestic drama, very short, takes place almost in real time in a suburban house, and it is a very intense piece of writing about characters in conflict. Her characterizations are fantastic. Some of the staging is arguably a bit, she refined her approach to theatre as she got to know her craft throughout her life. So there are stage directions and things which might not quite work, arguably, in an early play like The Lie. But The Lie is about a couple at odds with each other. The husband is having an affair. The husband who plays a lot of golf is having an affair, and the wife disappears for a night as a sort of almost a revenge. One can draw obvious parallels with the state of Agatha's marriage at the time and certain events that then unfolded in her life. I mean, I'm not somebody who focuses much on the disappearance, because I think it's given an importance in her life completely disproportionate to the event that it was. She didn't actually disappear. We all know where she was. She was in a hotel in Harrogate. But this play gives an insight, I think, into her state of mind at the time, shortly before those events, and I have dated it to then through a number of clues. I mean, the problem with any Agatha Christie researcher will tell you is that one of the biggest problems is she doesn't date anything, doesn't date manuscripts, doesn't date entries in her notebooks, doesn't date letters. So, you'll have a letter with a hugely important piece of information in it for research, and it just says Thursday on the top, So I've contextualized The Lie. I've managed to sort of date it as shortly before 1926. And I think it's a deeply significant work. It's quite like A Daughter's a Daughter, which was her Mary Westmacott play later on. I say there are three Mary Westmacott plays, which is The Lie, A Daughter's a Daughter, and Verdict, although Verdict was nominally a Christie thriller. So those three taken together are a substantial trilogy of domestic dramas dealing with, the personal interactions of family. And I actually adapted it for Radio 4 and directed it for Radio 4 with a wonderful team. So The Lie did eventually get its premiere on Radio 4 a couple of years ago, I'm delighted to say.
That's really fantastic. And you actually precipitated my next question, because I was going to say that I feel, after reading your book, that there are two strains of playwriting in Christie's work. There are the plays we all know, which are by no means a monolith. They're not all the same, but all of which I think are recognizable as being written by a successful and talented mystery writer. The Mousetrap, Witness for the Prosecution, Spider's Web, The Unexpected Guest, The Hollow, her adaptation of And Then There Were None, which is the title I choose to use on this podcast, even though it's not the one she did. Oh. And then there are the plays you just identified, the Mary Westmacott-ish plays, The Lie, A Daughter's a Daughter, and Verdict. I felt like, reading your book, you were at times wistful for the sort of playwright Christie could have been if she had been allowed to expand on this second strain of plays, the quote unquote Mary Westmacott plays. And she never really was. Is that fair of me to say?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair analysis. I mean, such was the demand for thriller writing from her. I'm not an expert on her novels, but obviously both in terms of her novels and her plays, that I think she had, Daughter's a Daughter got 1 week of performances at the Theatre Royal Bath. And then producer Peter Saunders decided not to take the risk to transfer it. It was under the name of Mary Westmacott. Verdict was a complete disaster. The curtain came down at the wrong time on the opening night, so the ending was badly damaged. The outcome of the play was entirely different. These plays were more fragile, but actually sit. When I produced for Bill Kenwright in the West End, A Daughter's a Daughter, eventually, and gave it its West End premiere, critics said it was like watching a Terence Rattigan play. And Rattigan Priestley, she has all these. She was a great theatre goer, so she knew about all this writing and how it all worked. She was a great observer of dramatic structure, and she could have been, I think, quite a substantial writer of domestic drama had she not been had she not had her arm twisted by producers to keep on writing thrillers. And that's why Verdict is so interesting, because it has a murder in it, but we see it's before the interval, and we see who's carried out the murder. It's done in front of our very eyes. The funny thing is that when I produced that one, the audience is still in the interval argue about who done it. You go, but you've just seen who done it. It's very obvious. But because it's Agatha Christie, they're expecting a double bluff, which of course never comes, and so there's that element of disappointment. But the referencing, the dialogue, the characterization is also strong in these domestic plays that I think she could have been a real voice, and it's a shame that she wasn't. But she did enjoy the success that she had as a dramatist hugely. I mean, she enjoyed the success of The Mousetrap, and she enjoyed the success of Witness for the Prosecution in particular. So, she's an undeniably successful playwright, but she could have been a very different playwright if she'd been allowed to follow her own course. And, the fact that she was a multi-million or now billion-selling novelist didn't make her work promoting herself as a playwright any easier. It has to be said, it didn't automatically open doors for her, which may have been an assumption that she just had to write something and it got put on. It was all the normal struggles of getting on a play, of finding a producer, raising the money, casting, happened to her as much as any other novice playwright. So it didn't give her a head start by any means, but she was very patient, and she devoted herself to the craft, and she watched and learned and developed her writing to the point where she could actually get stuff on with proper producers in the West End. But you're right. I think she could have been a very different playwright from the one we see. But there's elements of all that in things like The Mousetrap. All of those elements are there, the domestic drama. But could have been a different story. But the one we have is still a story of huge success, and one to be admired, I think.
Yeah, I think, and that's honestly similar to how I approach the novels as well, where I think there's a very reductive way that you can read her novels and say, oh, this is the one thing that she does. But no, actually, she's a brilliant writer who is doing a lot of different things at once, which is what all brilliant writers, I think, do. And you can see that that's happening in the plays as a playwright. But yeah, I mean, the story of Verdict in your book is just so fascinating. I mean, what a sort of marketing or branding disaster it was, even just down to the title, because her original title, Fields of Amaranth, is that right?
It was no Fields of Amaranth. Yeah, was the original title.
I mean, that feels like a Mary Westmacott. That feels okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Peter Saunders persuaded her to change the title to Verdict because there is an offstage court case at the end. But of course, this followed not long after Witness for the Prosecution, which is undeniably the best constructed courtroom drama in dramatic history, with amazing quadruple twist coup at the end. So suddenly, not having that, but having Verdict, and people go and see this domestic drama with a sort of rather gratuitous murder in the middle of it. And indeed, Patricia Jessel, who was the lead in Witness, playing the lead in Verdict as well, was very misleading. And I think people slightly resented that they'd been misled by the title. But, again, that wasn't Agatha Christie's fault. That was her producer's fault.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about her producer. Not her sole producer, but her producer of so very many of her plays. And I think a big part of her success that would, of course, be Peter Saunders. I love the context you provide for the state of the theater world in the 1950s in your book when Christie and Saunders started working together, because I think it's impossible to understand the effect Peter Saunders had on her career without this historical context. So forgive me because I am going to simplify things a bit here. I don't want you to have to do that, but my understanding is that the theatrical world of London, and more specifically the West End of the 1950s, was dominated by a sort of oligarchy, with all the decisions about who could produce which plays in which theaters and which actors could even be cast in those plays, resting in the hands of a small group of people, and to a large extent, even in the hands of one man, Binky Beaumont. And yet, Peter Saunders, who produced The Mousetrap and made Christie such a success on the West End, he operated very much outside this oligarchy. Could you explain a little bit what Peter Saunders was up against and how he operated within or around, I guess I should say, this system, putting on plays in the 1950s?
Well, I mean, Peter Saunders was a complete maverick. It's easy to forget now. He went on to become the establishment in himself, and to be knighted, of course. But he was a young producer just trying to get shows on in what was quite a difficult situation, because Binky Beaumont had a theatrical empire, which was a group of companies that under the name of Tennant, H.M. Tennant, Tennant Productions, Tennant Plays. And they pretty well had a monopoly on. I mean, it's a rather complex thing, but it was a rather clever piece of tax avoidance that enabled them to accumulate funds and to put on ever more lavish productions, pay actors big salaries, pay big royalties to new playwrights, particularly American ones. Block book the West End theatres, take joint ownership in many of the theatre buildings. I've done a lot of work and research on this because I think it's a forgotten piece of theatre history. But really, at this time, if you were a one-man band, which Peter Saunders was, it was very difficult to compete against this huge monopoly. At one point, Binky Beaumont had 14 shows on in the West End at the same time, which would be something that would, that's pretty well getting on for a third of the West End theatres under one management, under one producer, and that's not something we could contemplate these days. Even very powerful producers like Cameron Mackintosh, they don't have that many, they don't have that volume of control, and of course with that volume of control came that sort of circular argument where actors would only work for Binky Beaumont because if they didn't, they were afraid of getting blacklisted. There was actually some government intervention to try and stop this happening, but that's another story. It might be another book. But this is the atmosphere in which Peter Saunders was producing. The other thing about Binky Beaumont's productions was that they were quite highbrow. They were very high production values. The major actors of the day, major playwrights, although he was in a previous life involved in an adaptation of a Christie work onto his defining work in the West End. Binky Beaumont was sort of what you might call, inverted commas, upmarket. And Peter Saunders was regarded as producing, I suppose, what one might say more populist work, which is actually why he and Agatha Christie went together very well. At one point, he said words to the effect of, it's all very well arguing about fine wines, but, ultimately, I would rather be producing beer, and he made his point very well, because there's a big market for theatrical beer, as it were. But I mean, what people forget is that at this time, again, it's about the way theatre history is written. Everybody thinks about Osborne and the Royal Court and Look Back in Anger and so on and so forth. But actually, the shows that were selling the most tickets were Agatha Christie thrillers and Brian Rix farces at the Whitehall Theatre. There was a huge market in popular theatre, which has been largely ignored by theatre historians, in particular, the Cambridge Companion to 20th Century Female Playwrights, for instance. I keep coming back to shame on them. So Peter Saunders had to deal with fighting the monopoly to try and get his foot in the door at theatres. And of course, theatre programmes, anyone can advertise in them. So, there's a wonderful programme I have of The Hollow, when it moved to the Ambassadors Theatre, where there's about Pinky Beaumont has bought advertisements for about a dozen plays in the programme of The Hollow. So, even in his own theatre, with his own show on, Peter Saunders had Pinky Beaumont breathing down his neck, saying, "Look, here are my 12 plays. Come and see these." So it was the perception of the sort of theatre, and also just the sheer volume and trying to get a foothold in it, that made it so difficult. And actually, it was Agatha Christie's plays that gave Peter Saunders the success that he needed. So it was a fantastic partnership, the two of them. They did get on very, very well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you really do, I think, make that point quite well in the book about how there's that prevailing theatrical culture as sort of orchestrated by Pinky Beaumont and those in his circle. And then that countercultural movement, which is the one that I think is more familiar to most students of theater today, starting with Look Back in Anger by John Osborne. That was in 1956. I'm going to quote actually from you, because I think you just put it so well. You say, "She thus occupies a unique position as a playwright outside both the prevailing theatrical culture and its counterculture, and her theatrical vocabulary suits the historians of neither." And that really does affect how she is remembered or not remembered as a playwright. Do you think that that's changing? I mean, your book is an attempt to change that, right? So I imagine that you're contributing to this, but in the same way that people are reevaluating her contributions to literature in the 20th century, do you think that is changing at all in terms of her contributions to the 20th century as a playwright?
It definitely is. I don't want to fly my own flag too much in this context, but, coincidentally, since the publication of my book, what's happened is a lot of the plays I discovered have now been published by Samuel French. They don't give me a royalty, I have to say, but I'm not bitter. We've had, obviously, the 70th anniversary of The Mousetrap now. We've had a very good new production, A Witness for the Prosecution, on in London at the old GLC Hall. A sort of site-specific one where the council chamber sort of doubles as the Old Bailey quite convincingly. Less convincingly as the barristers' chambers, but, you can't have everything. And, some of these plays are now coming into circulation. And also there are there's academic writings about the theatre in much more volume than there were previously. So there's collections of academic work now always contain at least one piece of writing on, Christie's theatre, Christie's plays. And Lucy Worsley's new biography is the first one really to devote an entire chapter to Agatha Christie as a playwright. So it's, again, Lucy Worsley is a populist writer. She popularizes whatever subject she's writing about. Everybody is now much more focused on Agatha Christie's work as a dramatist. And I have to say, it's not to say that all the plays are brilliant. Even Shakespeare had his off days. There are some plays in her canon that don't stand up these days and shouldn't really be performed. But everybody, like Shakespeare, has their King John or whatever. There's always one or two that you wouldn't want to do. But I think what is clear is the huge variety of her work, and that's kind of what the stage, and that's what I've been trying to emphasize, is that they're not Cluedo games. Every play that Christie writes, she's experimenting with different genres, different ideas. The Mousetrap and Witness for the Prosecution, two most successful. Well, and then were none also, three most successful plays. Couldn't be more different in their construction. They're not by any means classic detective stories. None of them are Hercule Poirot solving the crime or Miss Marple. They're not. They're unique theatrical exercises in their own right. Very, very different from each other, and equally successful.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is a bit of a through line in your book as to your annoyance with Laura Thompson's biography, with the way that it minimizes or fudges Christie's theatrical achievements, that would have been the most recent biography when you were writing. Is that fair? It certainly seems like you were annoyed by
Well, I was annoyed, and actually Laura was a bit annoyed with me afterwards for being annoyed with her. So you might find that the paperback edition is slightly toned down in that respect. But people use the information that's available to them at any given time. In fairness, Laura was writing a biography, which in retrospect fails to highlight the importance of theatre into Christie as a person and in her life. But I was digging deep. I was researching specifically one particular area of, I'm no expert on Agatha Christie's life, on Agatha Christie's novels. I deal only with her work as a playwright and how that sits in the context of her work as a novelist and her life. So I was spending 100% of my research time researching Agatha Christie's plays, and I do acknowledge my references to Laura and indeed Janet Morgan's excellent biographies, in contextualizing that in my book.
And for the record, I love the Laura Thompson biography. I mean, I think it's some of the most beautiful writing about Christie. But and I love your book as well. So there's room in the world for both of them.
Exactly, I would say exactly that, and other biographies. And Janet's biography is fantastic. I mean, the problem with Janet's biography is that it doesn't give references for all the quotations she uses, and there's some wonderful stuff she's found in letters and stuff, and there's no footnotes. So you can't, as a researcher following her, you can't find the letter that she's quoted. But I mean, that is a brilliant book, and Lucy's book adds as well. I think just by popularizing the subject, I'm sure more people will have bought Lucy's biography than any previous biography because she's a very popular writer, a bit like Agatha Christie, So there's a place for everything, as you say, and I make no claim to be an expert in anything other than the plays.
Well, one more note about Peter Saunders, because this is just such a fun fact. I was so shocked to learn this in your book. By way of encouraging Christie to just sit down and write witness for the prosecution, when she said to him, well, why don't you write it yourself if you want it so badly? He actually did. He actually sat down, Peter Saunders, and wrote an adaptation of Witness for the Prosecution. I think that says a lot about Peter Saunders, his industriousness, his determination. But I'm still shocked, and I can't believe that actually happened. But it feels like that is very much in keeping with who he was.
Yeah, I mean, according to him, this happened. And according to correspondence, I've seen it happen. What I've never been able to find, though, is the script that he wrote. And it wasn't amongst his papers, and it's not been amongst his widow's papers when she passed away. So, that is a piece of Agatha Christie history that is waiting to be discovered by somebody. There will be a big prize to the person who can discover Peter Saunders' own adaptation of Witness for the Prosecution, or Traitor Hands, as it was adapted from the short story.
Right.
And, what one doesn't know is to what extent that inspired any of the way that Christie herself approached it. But we know it existed. We know it happened. She refers to it. He refers to it. But where is it? I mean, Peter Saunders did write another thriller play later on in life, which I have to say wasn't very good. But I think as a way of goading a playwright to write an adaptation, saying I'll do it myself as a producer and then doing it is a very good tactic.
Yeah, it really is. Bluff called. Good on him. Yeah, and I mean, and you do address that in the book. That does it seem? Is there any evidence that Christie's Witness for the Prosecution is different because it's in any way based on something that he wrote? It doesn't seem like it, right? Like it seems like she just more probably said, "Oh, okay, now I actually have to do this," and then just got started on her own.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of draft material and notes in the Christie archive. It's one of the better archive. There's more material relating to that than the others, and you see her working on her own material and adapting it. There's no obvious source. I mean, what she did do, there was a lot of legal advice on it. They did take expert legal advice, which is why it works so well as a courtroom drama because it is pretty well all correct. I mean, there's a couple of minor errors, but it's pretty well all correct in terms of courtroom procedures, which was very important to her because she didn't want to look stupid. So, she did get professional help.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
I've talked a number of times on the podcast about the importance of amateur productions of Christie's plays in terms of the way people know and consume Christie, specifically about how striking it is when you sign up for Google alerts for Agatha Christie, as I have for years now, and how many of the daily alerts have to do with amateur productions of her material being put up all the time. You point to this phenomenon in your book, though, as a potentially harmful thing, which I thought was really interesting. I'm going to quote from you again. It is undeniable that the enormous and enduring popularity of Christie's stage work in the repertory, secondary touring, and amateur markets inevitably resulted in an association with cut price and substandard productions, and a consequent law of diminishing returns as regards theatrical quality. Christie's estate have become sensitive to this in recent years and have done their best to reverse the trend with a licensing policy that prioritizes quality rather than quantity. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this, including the estate's more recent licensing policy.
Yeah, and to contextualize that, I think I've got to be very clear. Agatha Christie herself was a great supporter of amateur theatre, and I'm not denigrating amateur theatre in any way. What I'm really getting at is cut price professional productions, repertory productions, touring productions that were becoming substandard, to be quite honest. I mean, I've run theatres myself, and in the old days, touring Agatha Christie plays would come round, and they would be of a shockingly low standard because they can be relatively cost efficient to produce. And she often, gives notes about how to double characters and make things work for amateur companies, who she was very enthusiastic about. But in theatre history circles, the word amateur, inverted commas, has associations that make it a different sort of area of work than the West End, for instance, and that's just the way it is. So the associations, I think it was the law of diminishing returns, because Agatha Christie plays always sell tickets, whatever standard they are. So, a cut price production will sell a lot of tickets. Amateur productions always know that, they put Christie into the repertoire, they'll always sell. And like I say, I have to be absolutely clear, I'm a huge admirer of amateur dramatics. I've directed amateur dramatics myself many times, so this isn't to be misunderstood. But it's about contextualizing Agatha Christie's status as a playwright, and it's like it almost got overdone. There was too much of it, and it was quantity rather than quality. And now I would argue maybe the Agatha Christie licensing, it's sort of gone in the other direction, shall we say.
Well, I don't think that it's a secret among Christie aficionados that despite its enduring popularity, The Mousetrap isn't necessarily her best play. You say it is by no means her best work as a playwright. That is a quote from your book. I also think it's a fairly universal opinion that Witness for the Prosecution is one of her best plays, if not her very best. You call that one her dramatic masterpiece. But I'm curious, among the nearly 30 other plays she wrote, I did count them in the back of your book because you do have an index of plays, and the Agatha Christie ones are bolded, so it was easy for me to count that up. I'm wondering if among those, you have any that you would highlight as quality plays that any major fan of Agatha Christie should make a point of either watching or reading. We've already talked about The Lie and A Daughter's a Daughter, but are there any others? And also, a corollary to this is, do you have a personal favorite play of hers?
Well, other than Witness for the Prosecution, for obvious reasons, I think And Then There Were None, as we've said, stands up in the top three. There's some contention about the ending of And Then There Were None, because she wrote an ending when it was presented in the Second World War that changed the book and made it more, I think, accessible to wartime theatre goers, because the vision of the book is incredibly bleak, and it was the ending was sort of pepped up a bit to make it a happily ever after ending. So these days, productions of And Then There Were None, I was the first to do it, actually, use an ending derived from the book. And if you just change a few words at the end of that play, you get her original vision from the book. And it's a brilliant piece, because unlike other adaptations of it, it presents the work in one room on the only house on the island. So it's that sort of thing of, this is a Big Brother thing of, if you step out of the room, will you ever step back into it? And that claustrophobia is incredibly important to it and makes it work very well, better than other stage adaptations of it. Towards Zero, which is the 1945 original version of Towards Zero, which she wrote herself, and which I discovered in an archive in America, is a very, very good play. And we're doing a reading of it at the International Agatha Christie Festival in Torquay.
I'll be there. I can't wait.
On Agatha Christie's birthday this year. Spider's Web is an accomplished comedy. A Daughter's a Daughter, although technically by Mary Westmacott rather than Agatha Christie, is a fantastic drama. I think those would be my absolute top picks. So yes, And Then There Were None, Spider's Web, and A Daughter's a Daughter. So those would be my top picks alongside Witness for the Prosecution. And actually, the Mousetrap, I do put in the top three. I think the top three are Mousetrap, And Then There Were None, and Witness for the Prosecution, not in that order.
Well, and I love that you mentioned that version of Towards Zero that she wrote, because that's the one it was produced in Martha's Vineyard in the US, right? That's the only time that it actually...
Correct. It had 1 week of performances at Martha's Vineyard Playhouse in 1945, and then was a bit upstaged by Hiroshima, I think. But it was presented by the Schubert brothers, who had presented And Then There Were None on Broadway, and had also unsuccessfully presented Murder on the Nile under its other title, Hidden Horizon, and also The Hollow unsuccessfully on tour under the odd title The Suspects. Right. So they had actually commissioned this play from Agatha Christie, hoping to finally repeat the success of And Then There Were None. They asked her after the tryout to make some changes, but she didn't do that. And it went into their archive and disappeared from history. I mean, the family didn't know she'd written it. No researchers knew she'd written it. The archive didn't know she'd written it. And it was a real thrill to discover. I discovered through some correspondence of her agent, Edmund Corp, that this script had been commissioned. And I emailed the Schubert Archive, which is a brilliant theatrical archive of, over 100 years of theatrical production in New York. And I said, have you got any record of this script that she wrote for you? And they brought a box up from the basement, opened it, and found 3 copies of this script. And they said, well, we can send it to you by PDF, email it to you. And I said, no, I'm going to come to New York and hold it in my hands. And I'm so glad I did, of course, because while I was there, I spent a week researching in the Schubert archive the other plays, the successful, and then there were none of the other 2 that were unsuccessful. And got a very good steer on the way the Schubert operation worked, which was pretty ruthless, I have to say. The sort of Binky moments of Broadway. And I also was able to visit some other key American archives while I was out there. So it was a very useful visit. And actually, that one script triggering my visit there has enabled me to fill in a lot of the story from the American angle on Agatha Christie's plays, which I hope does come through to your American listeners.
Yeah, well, and Martha's Vineyard is just a particularly and peculiarly beautiful place. I was just there recently, earlier this summer, and the play itself, she set it outside, right? And I when I was reading your book, I was just imagining that 1 week run, and I often fantasize about being able to travel back in time for specific shows that I could watch. And I was like, oh, that one would be worth a time travel, because that must have been really interesting.
Well, interestingly, I found a review of it in the Martha's Vineyard Gazette archive.
Right.
So, we not only have the script, but we have the one review ever written of the play. And yes, she does set it in the open air. It was performed indoors at Martha's Vineyard. Agatha Christie oddly publish it as Towards Zero brackets open air version, which obviously doesn't need to be,
right.
But it should be Towards Zero brackets Agatha Christie's original 1945 version. But never mind. But yeah, that was a lovely discovery. And yeah, like you, I would love to have seen that. But it really does stand on its own 2 feet. Now, I have to say that the British premiere of it was given by an amateur company in Norwich. They very kindly invited me to see it, and it was an excellent production. So, the amateur dramatists can bravely and proudly fly the flag that they've given the British fully staged premiere of this Agatha Christie script.
Well, and of course, the reason why it's all a little confusing is that there is another adaptation of Towards Zero, right? Which is not hers, or not hers in the same way. Obviously, that too is based on her novel. And that brings me to the next issue I wanted to discuss a little bit when it comes to Christie's plays, which in a way I think is a sign of her great success. And that has to do with confusion between plays she adapted from her own work and plays other people adapted from her work. And it seems like the lines between the two were often blurred by those in Christie's camp for the purpose of filling seats. And you talk about this in the book, so I'm going to quote from you again. This deliberate and continuous blurring of the lines by her own agent, and indeed by producers, regarding the authorship of the plays only served further to damage Christie's reputation in the theatrical community. A number of the third-party adaptations that carry her name are markedly inferior to her own work, and where her own writing for the stage was concerned, there would always be the assumption, or at least the suspicion, that other parties were involved. It is critically important to an appreciation of Christie as a playwright that a proper distinction is made between her own plays and those written by others who borrowed her name. Which plays written or co-written, kind of, sort of, by other people do you think are the worst culprits here?
Well, you mentioned Towards Zero, which Gerald Werner wrote in the 1950s, and they sort of put Agatha Christie's name on it as a sort of co-authorship, because that was right in 1956, right at the height of her success herself as a playwright. That is a very dull adaptation, unlike hers, which is, as you say, set outside on the terrace and outside of the house and the gardens and a cliff face. A rather interesting set, for which I found a drawing that a friend of hers did as a sort of set design, which was very interesting. So Towards Zero, the Gerald Werner adaptation, is just the normal French windows set in the drawing room of the house. And that, of course, diminishes, there's a lot of confusion, because the licensing authorities of Agatha Christie Limited are gradually differentiating between the two successfully. But as you say, if you go online, it's quite difficult to tell the difference between Gerald Werner's adaptation and Agatha Christie's own adaptation, which I discovered, which of course predated it. There's Love from a Stranger, which Frank Vosper adapted in the 1930s, 1936, allegedly from her book, from her short story Philomel Cottage, but she had herself already written a script called The Stranger, which is unpublished and probably still unperformed. I'm not sure yet. So he had taken that script and adapted it and put his name on it. I think because he was offered the leading role in her script and probably wanted to beef up the part for himself. So we all know Love from a Stranger as a rather overblown Frank Vosper script adapted from Agatha Christie, whereas in fact she'd already written her own really good, fit-for-purpose, small cast version. Alibi, which is the murder of Roger Ackroyd, stage adaptation. Obviously, as we know about the storyline of Murder of Roger Ackroyd, that is quite difficult to stage because of the payoff ultimately. Peril at End House, Arnold Ridley again on the eve of World War II. Mayor at the Vicarage again. I mean, you've got these other plays being written by other playwrights, adapting her novels or short stories during her own career as a playwright. And of course, what the producers do is they go, Agatha Christie's Towards Zero, Agatha Christie's Love from a Stranger. And then in the small print, you see it's actually written by somebody else, adapted from one of her books. So it is her story, but it's been written by somebody else. And the bottom line is she's a much better playwright herself than any of her other adapters. So it does slightly tarnish her reputation as a playwright. Well, more than slightly, actually. It badly damages her reputation as a playwright because, Michael Billington, in a newspaper article in the 1990s, said that the newspaper critic said, oh, well, we all remember, in the repertory theatre, having to do Agatha Christie's internally boring play, with boring dialogue, Peril at End House. And I pull him up on that in jokingly in my book and say, a theatre critic of his standing really should know the difference between an Agatha Christie play and a play written by somebody else. So that is a problem in terms of her status as a. And again, you ask anybody who wrote The Mousetrap, they do actually pause for a moment and think, oh, who adapted The Mousetrap? And actually it was Agatha Christie, and she wasn't adapting it from a novel, from a short radio play. So it's a unique situation in my experience as an entertainment historian. This odd thing where a playwright is fighting a reputation as a playwright, which has been developed through other people's plays, and there are posthumous. After she died, adaptations continued to come, and there are some really shockingly bad plays, I have to say, but I won't name them. I won't name them, Shane.
Well, and at the very least, there's less confusion, I think, after her death, obviously, but the confusion remains where those plays are concerned that were written during her career, because, as you said, I was giving a talk the other night, and some very nice people were talking about their work in amateur dramatics and how they'd done Agatha Christie's The Hollow and Agatha Christie's The Murder Is Announced, and they were in the plays and they were unaware of the difference that, she wrote The Hollow, but she didn't write the stage version of A Murder Is Announced. And the people who are performing the plays. So I think there's still a battle to be fought on, educationally on that with her work. But, it's a battle that I will continue to fight. I have no doubt of that, Julius.
With the assistance of people like you, Cameron. Thank you.
Well, I also really appreciated in your book the insight you provided as to why Christie exercised the instinct of a playwright in excising Poirot from her Poirot stories when she adapted them for the stage. Yes, she did write Black Coffee, but that was not an adaptation. That was an original play, and it does feature Poirot. But all of the adaptations of Poirot stories remove Poirot from the proceedings among the plays that she wrote. And again, that's part of the confusion. There are certainly other people who did put Poirot on the stage. But I love what you had to say about this. You wrote that the function of a detective, after all, is to observe. And in a detective novel, the reader is invited to join the detective in this process. On film, camera angles and editing can focus the audience's attention on specific characters and events. But on stage, the audience is liable to be distracted from the observational process by the detective's constant presence in their line of vision. Ironically, rather than observing what the detective is observing, as in a book or a film, they end up observing the detective, especially if a particularly flamboyant actor has commandeered the role, say Charles Laughton or Francis Sullivan. So do you, I think you're absolutely right, but this got me thinking, is there absolutely no place for a detective on the stage? Can this problem be resolved in some way?
Yeah, I think it can be, and she doesn't remove the role of the detective. So,
Right.
I mean, well, I suppose in Murder on the Nile, Hidden Horizon, she replaces the detective with Canon Pennefather. So there isn't a detective there. But in The Hollow, there's, an inspector. So I think it's just about as you say, the flamboyance of the character. And people read Poirot books because they want to read Poirot, and I've produced Black Coffee, and we had the, wonderful actors. Robert Powell played Poirot to start with. And, it was a brilliant performance. But as soon as he walked on the stage, all anyone could do was look at him because they want to watch Poirot. Whereas some of the detectives that she puts into her stage plays are very, very back foot. They're not characterful at all. They're deliberately sort of neutral characters who come in and ask questions. They're just interrogators. They don't in them have quirks. They're not flamboyant. They're not characterful. So the inspector in The Hollow, he's just there for the function of asking questions and getting answers out of people. And unexpected guests and all of them. So she does have stage detectives, but they are not the star of the show, if you see what I mean. The leading actors in her plays are, the family in the house in which the crime is committed or whatever. And of course, there's another twist in that story in The Mousetrap. But it's a really important thing. And her dramatic instincts were exactly right on that front. So, Appointment with Death, The Hollow, Go Back for Murder, Murder on the Nile, she gets rid of Poirot. And she herself never wrote a Marple play, of course, for exactly the same reason. There's been a quite good adaptation of The Mirror Cracked a couple of years ago, which sort of works with Marple there. But it is that issue of focus, as you rightly say. And how they got away with it at the time, I've no idea. To my mind, they were lucky they didn't have people asking for their money back because Poirot wasn't in it. I think these days, if you put on a Poirot play without Poirot in, people will be keen to get their money back post David Suchet. But, and again, of course, those flamboyant actors, Lawton, Sullivan, Suchet, they have defined that character in their own ways. And it's very hard to escape from that now for any actor, I think. I mean, there's been a stage version of Murder on the Orient Express, but I think that's a bit. I've not actually seen it, but it's not enjoyed huge success.
Yeah, I think there would be riots in the streets, riots down Shaftesbury or something if Poirot.
Well, can you imagine new stage version of Murder on the Orient Express, but Poirot isn't in it? Don't think anyone would get away with that. Probably.
Right. But instead there's this canon character, who's going to be the stand-in. Yeah. But it does provide, I'm not sure if you were the one who said this or someone else, it's not going to work every time, but it is a little bit of a helpful shorthand if you are trying to sort out which of these plays based on the novels Agatha Christie wrote and which she didn't. If it's a Poirot play, if it's a play based on a Poirot novel and Poirot isn't in it, chances are Agatha Christie wrote it. If Poirot is in it, she did not write it. So that's, that's at least a little bit of a... If it's
got Miss Marple in it, she didn't write it.
Yeah. Right, exactly. If you are seeing Poirot or Marple on the stage, Agatha Christie did not write that play unless you're watching Black Coffee.
Indeed. Or The Wasp's Nest.
It's such a tangled web, web, these plays. Well, I wanted to ask you something also a little bit juicy. You mention the director Hubert Gregg several times in your book. He directed the original Christie plays, The Hollow and The Unexpected Guest, as well as a number of Christie's later and less successful plays. And it seems that Hubert Gregg had a bone to pick with Christie, perhaps based in part on the fact that Christie didn't mention him in her autobiography. In 1980, he wrote this memoir, Agatha Christie and All That Mousetrap, which is a book I actually own, but I have not read it yet. It's on my shelf. It's burning a hole in my shelf, and I will read it at some point soon and talk about it either on this regular podcast or perhaps in a Patreon episode. It sounds like Hubert Gregg makes all sorts of bizarre and insulting claims about Agatha Christie in this book. Could you just talk a little bit about him and the book and his legacy when it comes to his role in Agatha Christie's theatrical life?
Well, he's one of these people whose self-written legacy with Agatha Christie is hugely important. But I mean, he directed The Hollow. He was not a major league director. It was Peter Saunders' first Agatha Christie play because her previous producers wouldn't do The Hollow for whatever reason. So young Peter Saunders managed to get The Hollow as his first Agatha Christie play. And the best director he could get was Hubert Gregg, who, as I say, was not major league. I mean, I did get hold of some papers of Hubert Gregg, which were in the antiquarian bookseller market. There's a lot of stuff, Christie stuff, where you have to get friends with antiquarian booksellers and go and sit in their stores looking at letters and scripts and things. And the people selling this collection of Hubert Gregg's papers and notes on The Hollow and other things he directed very kindly let me go and sit in their shop because I certainly couldn't afford to buy them at the price they were charging, because it included letters from Agatha and, of course, anything with their signature on has huge commercial value. But they let me read them. And, he, like any director, in fairness to Hubert Gregg, he does input. He does say, why don't we change this line? Why don't we change that line? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Agatha's lack of stagecraft is occasionally apparent where, somebody goes to put the kettle on and make tea and walks back in 30 seconds later with a tray full of tea and things like that. Simple things which he directs. But then, he begins to take ownership as almost like a co-author. Agatha Christie was very adaptable. She liked working with directors. She liked working with actors. I think she really enjoyed the collective effort of getting on a play, because, of course, writing a book is an incredibly lonely pursuit. You're on your own in your room with your tape recorder or your typewriter or your pen and paper, whereas a play is made in a room full of people. You write the script and then people do change scripts in rehearsal, and she enjoyed that process, and she listened to people, and like many playwrights would allow directors to put in bits, change bits. But that doesn't mean that, they are authorial collaborators. That just means that they're directors. And I could see in The Hollow the exact extent to which Hubert Gregg was, making those notes. And yeah, arguably there was a fair amount in The Hollow, but, this was the first time they'd worked together. It was her first post-war success, and he did a bit of tightening up and trimming as any director would. But then in later life, he then took over the resident directorship of The Mousetrap for a period of time. The Unexpected Guest, again, he made a few edits too. And then he was in charge of, the ones that didn't work right at the end, Go Back for Murder and The Rule of Three. But he came out of it sort of claiming that he came up with the title of The Mousetrap, claiming that he came up with a twist ending to Witness for the prosecution, which he wasn't even involved in. And so there seems to be some bitterness. And then, he is very uncomplimentary about Agatha Christie's personality in rehearsals, publishes a truly shocking picture of her as an old woman, which, was just rude, really. And just seems a bit bitter and twisted about the whole thing. Whereas, in fact, what Agatha Christie did was give him a lucrative source of work. It increased his prominence as a director and helped to put him on the map, So it just seems a bit discourteous and disgruntled and unnecessary. But it's an extraordinary book. I mean, you will enjoy reading it because of the perspective that it gives on it, And if Hubert Gregg makes himself out to be an incredibly important player in Agatha Christie's dramatic success, I would argue that he wasn't. He was, as it were, a legend in his own lunchtime. But I'll be interested to see what you think of it. It's a very strange book, but as I say, I've actually been able to analyse, oddly, because these papers came to light, able to analyse the extent of his claimed input into The Hollow. And I would say that it's probably no more nor less than any other director working on a new play.
Yeah, it sounds so scathing and so bitter, and I think it's unusual for a book that raw to be published. And even the title, right? The Agatha Christie and All That Mousetrap, that's a play on the Cockney slang convention of rhyming, right? So I think that's supposed to be referenced. It's sort of Agatha Christie and all that crap. That's what
I don't think it's complimentary, put it that way. It doesn't, even the rhythm of it doesn't sound complimentary.
No, it doesn't. And there's even, and at least the copy I have, there's a drawing, a sort of caricature of Agatha Christie on the cover that is also just rather insulting and not, complimentary to her appearance. And
I mean, she doesn't mention in her autobiography. We got to remember that the autobiography was written in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great, I'm sure you've read it. It's a wonderful book, but it concentrates largely on her early life. And of course, her theatrical success came in later years, So, many of the years in which she was dealing with Hubert Gregg, are actually right towards the end of that, or indeed after she finished writing it, because she lived on well beyond the end of the writing of her own autobiography. So there is that oddness as well. But I mean, she doesn't actually mention the directors of any of her plays other than Irene Henschel, who directed And Then There Were None, because she was particularly impressed with her dramatic processes. But I'm only making the assumption that he was annoyed at not having been mentioned. It's just an assumption of mine, but he's the sort of guy who would have liked Agatha Christie to mention her huge debt to his dramatic prowess as a director.
Right.
And she certainly very conspicuously failed to do so, probably consciously.
I mean, yeah, she leaves out so much in the autobiography. I think there are many people besides Hubert Gregg who, if they chose, could have been offended, but were not. So that says.
But as we say, the chronology of its writing means that its focus is, it's not really a complete autobiography. It's a substantial one, but it's not really complete when it gets towards the end.
Well, I have to ask you what you made of the feature film See How They Run, which fictionalizes the 100th performance of The Mousetrap with its own backstage murder. But of course...
I have to say, although I've written a little bit on it in some press stuff, I haven't seen the thing fully. People who I would expect to have really hated it haven't done, I have to say. It has some interesting casting in it, I gather. And what can I say? It is what it is. I mean, it's a spoof, and many great works of theatre and, Agatha Christie's plays have been spoofed many times. I mean, I think the play that goes wrong is they're putting on some sort of detective story, and The Real Inspector Hound and all of this stuff. It's part of the status of something that every so often a comedy version, or an homage, a spoof arises. So I don't think it's done too much harm, has it?
I don't know. I don't think so. And I did watch it, and I reviewed it even for the podcast or on the podcast Patreon account. And I think it doesn't go off the rails until the end when Agatha Christie herself appears. There's a sequence at the very end that feels a little bit like, how do we end this thing? Where are we going here? But before that, it's when they're in the theater and we see Richard Attenborough and Sheila Sim. I mean, that's really fun. And I think that the scenes that are set in and around the theater itself are great, actually.
You're sort of confirming what I've heard from elsewhere, is that aficionados of Agatha Christie have gone, all right, they can get away with that.
Exactly. Maybe not the most rousing response, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. We're not going to stand and cheer, but we're not going to boo either. I'm sure there will be more spoofs of Agatha Christie and The Mousetrap in the future. It's a sign of affection, I think. It's a sign of the affection which she's held. And also, the assumptions that something like that makes of knowledge of her work in an audience, again, indicates how popular she is and how much everybody knows who she is, what she does, what The Mousetrap is. So again, it sort of, in a way, confirms, if something is being spoofed, it confirms the status of the thing that's being spoofed, I think, if you see what I mean.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's the ultimate compliment, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm looking for. The ultimate compliment.
And I'm also curious, what do you think about the fact that The Mousetrap is finally coming to Broadway?
Well, allegedly. Has it been announced yet?
It seems to be happening, But I mean, I know in the world of theater, it doesn't happen until it happens, right? But that seems to be.
I mean, the announcement came on pretty well the 70th anniversary, I think. Peter Saunders, as I say in my book, always resisted the temptation to take the Mousetrap to Broadway. Because, I mean, the two big hits, Agatha Christie's only hits on Broadway were Witness for the Prosecution and Then There Were None, which are very, very different kettles of fish to the Mousetrap, with its setting and its characters and its language. If I was the producer, I'd be quite wary of exposing it to Broadway. I mean, Saunders deliberately didn't, because of the huge success of the other two. I mean, he didn't produce And Then There Were None, but Witness, he, co-produced with the American producers, and it was a huge, huge success. I mean, the success at the time was huge. And then the film came, of course, as well. So to a Broadway that remembers Witness for the Prosecution, I think The Mousetrap is a slightly more delicate proposition. It's a slightly more fragile plot. We will see. We'll see. I mean, I don't know if they're going to do a new production of it or replicate the London production. There's arguments for both, because there's actually, there is still to be done quite a hard-hitting contemporary version of The Mousetrap, which is about, of course, as partly as we know from the film we were just discussing, is about the long-term consequences of child abuse, for instance, which could be regarded as quite a contemporary subject. But I would be very cautious with that one. If it goes ahead, I hope it doesn't get damaged. With the current state of Broadway, I'm not entirely sure that there's room for The Mousetrap. But I wish it well, and I have my fingers crossed if it goes, and I'll come and see it.
It'll be interesting. I mean, yes, it's such that production. I mean, it's such a British institution, and that was where my head went as well. I was like, well, is it going to look different?
I mean,
or exactly the same?
You're walking into a West End theatre, which is a little ornate jewel of a theatre, and it's almost an immersive theatrical event from the moment you walk through the door. Because there's original signage, and you feel like you're stepping back in time. You are seeing a production that was directed in 1952 and, still has a sofa in the middle of the stage facing the audience, which, nobody would do these days. And performances that are very British and very finely judged between, the seriousness of the subject matter, but also a little twinkle in the eye of comedy, which is quite strong in the piece as well. I mean, the big debate in the pre-West End tour between Agatha, the director, and Peter Saunders was how much of the comedy in The Mousetrap should stay in. And I think, the way it's performed and delivered these days, it has exactly the right balance. But it's also a retro experience. You step back in time. It's got a quality to it that is very carefully preserved in that building. There's dust there that was there in 1952, probably. So I think you have to be very careful, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like going into a living museum, and I think people check
it's vintage. It's vintage. It's what you would call vintage theatre now, I suppose.
I know, absolutely, and I think that's how people, when they go to London and they say, okay, well, what are the things that I need to do? Going to see The Mousetrap is one of those boxes that they check, and there's just no way that seeing The Mousetrap on Broadway in New York is going to be that same experience. So yeah, I mean, in a way, it's like reviving the play or bringing it, even if the production is exactly the same, it's going to be bringing it into the present day, I think, in a way that is not happening in its current form in London. But it'll be interesting if it happens, as you say. This is all hypothetical, but I hope not. I'm always interested to see how Agatha Christie fares and happy to see new material coming up. So I wanted to ask you a few final questions on more of a personal level. I'm curious how you yourself discovered Agatha Christie. I'm going to assume it was through her novels, but maybe I shouldn't assume that. How did you first come to Agatha Christie?
I did read some of her books when I was very young, probably early teens. When I was 12, 13, I would read them and was very gripped by them. But then I drifted away from that. And it only came back to me. I was running a regional theatre in the UK. And we couldn't sell tickets for anything for love nor money. And we had great stars appearing, and I got all my mates down to appear, and we couldn't sell tickets for any shows. And then a touring production of The Unexpected Guest came to the theatre, which we booked in, and it sold every single ticket just overnight. No big stars in it. It's kind of what I was talking about, a wobbly scenery, and it just sold out. And me and the artistic director of the theatre stood at the back going, what is this phenomenon? And we sensed that it was actually quite a good play and maybe could be done better. So we drove back to London, and in the conversation in the car, we thought, well, let's do a little season of Agatha Christie plays, like they did in the old days, a little rep season of Agatha Christie plays. And then we thought, well, why don't we do all of them? And then, I did a bit of research with, and Matthew Pritchard was very helpful. And, we dug out all the plays that we could find and got some good directors, good actors, and did the Agatha Christie Theatre Festival over 12 weeks, in which we did 20-odd plays performed by 25 actors in daily rep in a studio and on the main stage. And people came from all over the world for us. It was a big success. But, my abiding memory of the visiting production of Unexpected Guest to this little theatre was that in the interval, an elderly gentleman had a heart attack and was taken to hospital, and his wife stayed for the second half to see who'd done it. And I thought, there is something here. So we did this big festival. We explored all of the plays as were then known. We had talks, we had a bookshop, we had a festival bar, and we really invigilated her work as a playwright. And as a result of that, oddly, the estate withdrew all licensing for Agatha Christie plays while it worked out what it was going to do next. And then it gave me the license for the Agatha Christie Theatre Company. So, that was a worthwhile exercise.
That's so great. Oh, I love that The Unexpected Guest then was sort of your entree into the...
Her as a playwright, certainly. It was the first Agatha Christie play I saw. And it was quite, not as a young person, I have to say. The rest, as they say, is history.
We already talked about which among the plays are your favorites, and forgive me for harping on the novels for this tiny fraction of our conversation, but do you have a favorite Christie novel?
I mean, of the ones I read, and I can't claim to have read a huge number, but obviously read all the ones that are associated with her as a playwright,
sure,
either directly or indirectly. But I mean, the one that I read as a novel, as a young person, that stuck with me was And Then There Were None, and that's sure. That's the obvious answer, isn't it?
Well, it's an obvious answer for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. What can you say?
Well, this is going to be my final question, Julius, and I can't believe I'm going to ask it because I think I know the answer, but maybe I actually don't. I ask nearly everyone this question who appears on the podcast as my final question. If you had to choose, who would you choose, Poirot or Marple?
I would say Poirot. There's an answer. Poirot is a much more, I know there have been brilliant Miss Marples, but I mean, the repertoire of actual work is more substantial in the case of Poirot. So I think he's probably a character who she invigilated more thoroughly. I think there's more of him and we know more about him. And Marple is unique and interesting for a large number of reasons, but the storylines of the Poirots, I think, from what I know of them, we've got some real proper classics. I mean, Murder on the Orient Express is pretty hard to beat, I think, as a dilemma for a detective.
Well, I thought that would be your answer, because I think for one who was focused on the plays of Agatha Christie, again, I mean, not that there's a ton of Poirot in Agatha Christie's own adaptations of her work, but there's some. And as you mentioned, I mean, she never brought Miss Marple to the stage. So I think there's just more to hold on to.
And there have been stage. Yeah. I mean, the early stage appearances of Poirot were quite formative, her decisions as a playwright, as we discussed earlier. So right. Whether Poirot is there or not there, and even if he's not there, he's really important by not being there. You know what I mean? So the fact that he's not there underlines his importance as a character in many ways, but for the reasons we discussed, maybe not successfully portrayed on stage.
I love that. Your answer is Poirot due in part to his absence as opposed to his presence, which is not the reason why many people have answered Poirot who have answered that question, but that makes perfect sense given what your focus is. Well, Julius, this was such a fantastic conversation. I only wish that we had had it sooner, and I'm so excited for people to be listening to this and also to be able to check out your book, which does have I have been working off of your original hardback version, but I believe there is also a more recent paperback edition as well, which looks very attractive and which is available for people to pick up. I obviously cannot recommend it enough. And I just want to thank you for giving us so much of your time to discuss Agatha Christie in the theater.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it, Ken.
Thank you again to Julius Green. I had been looking forward to that conversation for some time, and it did not disappoint. I obviously recommend that if you are interested in Agatha Christie in the theater, that you go out and buy Julius's book, Curtain Up, Agatha Christie, A Life in the Theater. So I mentioned up top that I am doing a series on Agatha Christie and the theater, and my very next episode will be episode number 2 in this series. It's going to be one of my overview episodes that I've been doing recently, all about the plays of Agatha Christie. Just an overview because, as Julius and I just discussed, there really are so many plays that Agatha Christie wrote, many more than I think most Christie fans realize. So I think it would be helpful just to give an overview of what those plays are and to kind of sort and categorize them and get a general lay of the land. So that will be next time. Until then, should you want some bonus content, you can head on over to the podcast's Patreon page. I have provided a link in the notes to this episode. I will be dropping a new Patreon episode tomorrow for August. And that one will be all about Agatha and the Curse of Ishtar, this wonderful alternate reality television film that aired in the UK in 2019 and then in the US in 2021. It is available to stream. I had such a good time watching it. So if you'd like to hear my review and analysis, you can head on over to Patreon. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And you can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. Please take a moment to give the podcast a rating and or a review. Those ratings still really help me out. I cannot get enough of them. And I will see you next time. Bye.
Fill your summer with the sun-kissed sweetness of Amigos Refreshers. There's strawberry acai, blueberry dragon fruit, and mango passion fruit, each a tropical delight. So skip the hot coffee and amp up your day with the plant-based natural caffeine and fruity flavor fusions in an Amigos Refresher. These cool thirst quenchers are just $3.99, or there's a mega 32-ounce size for $4.99. Recharge with the bold, fresh flavor of an energizing refresher at Amigos.
If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.